There you are.
Good
Okay.
morning.
Hello, Michelle.
How are you?
I'm well and delighted to be here and just waiting for Jodine to join us.
Absolutely.
And I can see that there's a number of people that are waving. So thank you so much for joining us, for being with us. Instagram Live. Thank you for joining us again. And for all of you who have not been with us and who are wondering what are we doing talking at noon on a Wednesday
for joining us
morning,
again.
let us tell you that we are here with the Milk Educational Program. For all of you who have seen Milk, you probably are familiar with the film, and for all of you who have not seen the film, big encouragement here to please join us and watch it and go to milkhood.com and find out what we are up to. The Milk Educational Program exploring further how to prevent and how to support caregivers and moms and professionals in the field of newborn health. To have a good beginning. Milk is a film that unites the voices of moms from around the world and professionals in a plea for help when we discuss politics and the commercialization of birth and infant feeding. Most important right now, we are proud to bring Milk back with the educational program focusing on emergency situations. We have been working on this program since September. We have gone across Canada to a number of locations where we have been able to create some very, very interesting conversations and have been in touch with a lot of people who have found the discussions inspiring and insightful into being prepared. Fed Canada, a national organization from Canada who specializes in emergency situations. What to do when we have a problem in our community, let's call it like that, when we have to evacuate, when we have a flood, when we have a wildfire, or other things that prevent us from having our normal life. And today we are going to be talking about water. So let me introduce all of you, Michelle Branco from Safely Fed Canada, and I'm trying to see where Jodine is with us. And let me just see if I can bring her in. Hold on one second, please. And I think that I see her now. There we go. I think Jodine will be able to join us. Sorry about my technical inability. Chase joining us from Edmonton and Michelle from Toronto. And let's talk about water. Why are we talking about water? Why water is so important that we need to be prepared if there is an emergency?
Good morning. Thank you for having us. We're so excited to do this second Instagram Live. It's feeling less and less scary every time we do one, so we'll get there eventually. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I think that's the issue of water is so central, right? We always talk about water as like the giver of life, but from the perspective of emergencies, very quickly we discover that that's one of the first things that really sort of begins to create problems and worries for people when their normal systems are disrupted. So, and in fact, in the film, that's one of the big themes around the dangers is immediately the availability of water is well understood, is obvious. But I think a lot of the times we don't really understand what quantity of water we're talking about. And I think it's quite surprising to people to realize how much water they're really talking about when they're talking about keeping clean and safe and preparing foods, particularly infant formula in an emergency, for sure.
So how do we do that? If something comes up, we have to run. We have to go somewhere. we have a baby with us, if a grandmother is with that baby and that baby is being formula fed, and how do you transport all this water?
Yeah, it's really a challenge, right? We think about water as being for babies anyway, from the perspective of a baby, that you need enough water to reconstitute their food if they're not breastfeeding, and that's about 750 milliliters to a liter a day at the high end. But so I mean, to carry 3 liters of water with you is already 3 kilos that you need to throw into a backpack. But in fact, the amount of that amount of water is really the really small amount of the total, because what we really need water for is for cleaning and preparation, for sterilization. And when we look at those numbers, if you're talking about a baby who's fully formula fed, so a baby who's under 6 months, fully formula fed, using powdered formula, you're looking at about 24 hours grams of weight to carry, quite a large volume, and that's per day. And typically when we're talking about an emergency kit, we're talking about a 3-day kit as a minimum. So that's a really substantial amount of water. I couldn't carry 75 kilograms of water, even if it was the only thing I was carrying.
Yeah.
Jodine, I think you remember the story about the first time we put together one of these 3-day kits for a conference.
Oh yeah.
I packed it all into the back of my little SUV, and it barely fit in the back of my SUV. And we were sort of looking at each other going, I don't know about this. By the time we got into the actual conference, we were sweating and exhausted, and we didn't have a baby or a stroller or anything else to carry. So understanding that the reality is really a challenge.
Let's talk, Michelle, about what that water is actually for, right? Because
that's a good point.
Might be thinking, like, do you really need, like, what is that 24 liters of water for? And I think it's important to break it down. And first of all, it's important for us to know that caregiver, Noemi, you gave a really good example of, say I'm with one of my grandchildren who is in the moment, it depends on the formula, or maybe I have breast milk that was left behind and I'm caregiving for an hour and a half, grand sitting while my family away, and then suddenly for whatever reason I need to evacuate. I may have to swing by the grocery store and pick up some supplies. And water for the caregiver, for the mother, that's just the amount of water that's necessary if you're using powdered formula, as Michelle said, not just to mix the formula, but the actual water for each feed. There's 8 in a day for a baby that's exclusively dependent on either breast milk or formula on average. So you need the water to mix with a powder, but you need to put a pot, water in a pot. You need to sterilize the equipment, especially important if you are in an emergency setting because you're exposed to more. You also need to wash the preparation surface. You need to wash your and it 24 liters per day in total. So let's talk about that. Now, is it realistic to expect somebody to haul 24 liters with them, to think, okay, I need 72 hours because I'm evacuated. There's a wildfire in my town. I'm going to flee. Is it realistic to expect the 24 liters of water? Maybe not. Maybe what we're talking about here is what the folks that are prepared to receive us have in place, right? Because when you're fleeing, you bring as much as you can, but you're also going somewhere, and local authorities help support you to make sure that your immediate needs are
right. So to that point, we live in a country like Canada that in most places, not everywhere, there is clean water from the tap. How important is it at all places? But we do know that some remote communities in Canada don't have access to clean water as well. But if anyone is joining us from around the world today, we know very well that in some countries, clean water is a problem. So how important is bottled water versus water from the tap?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question, because a lot of times that's the solution that people offer in various places. They'll send in trucks full of bottled water. The challenge with that is a couple things. One is that just trucking in that quantity of water for a community is really, again, it's a big burden. Water is heavy, right? And it takes up a lot of space. The other thing I think is that we have an assumption that we have, clean water in Canada and in many parts of the world, but there are both long-term, decades-long periods of time when communities, even that aren't particularly remote, have water that's not potable coming out of their taps. But there are also situations where you have supply. I'm thinking back to Iqaluit a couple of years ago, where they had contamination, which is a particularly hard kind of contamination. They had contamination, I think it was with a petroleum product at the time. So when we think about dirty water, we tend to think about dirty like sewage or actual dirt, but there can also be chemical contamination, and you can't boil off chemical contamination, just like you can't boil off radiation contamination. So there are certain times when even a community that has a good water system can't use that water. And I think in those cases, a couple of things are really important. One is it's really maximizing the amount of breastfeeding, because those children are then protected by their access to human milk directly. And typically an adult can drink other things and can adapt their diet in ways that infants also need to try and supply and prepare for the minimum amount of water needed during that emergency period. So rather than stocking powder, we want to be able to stock something that's ready to feed in really small containers, so that it's a disposable product, right? You feed the baby, you throw that bottle out, it's done, or that cup out, it's done. The other piece I think that's really very important is around understanding the risks of bottles and how difficult it is to really clean a bottle, and how much water and soap it takes to really clean a bottle thoroughly. You can't just rinse it out and then reuse it. It really needs to be scrubbed clean and then boiled. And that's one of the reasons why we encourage people to learn the skill and have available little disposable paper cups that can be used for one feeding and thrown out. They don't need to be sterilized, and they don't. So that's one of the really key things that I think, again, isn't always so clear, is that there's different kinds of contamination. And the two things that we can do really is minimize dependence on those products for those really vulnerable babies. And then on the other side, make it much easier to feed those babies without having to wash bottles and scrub them.
Yeah, I just want to jump in, Michelle, and note that comment in the chat here, I think it's really relevant to the difference between emergency setting and day-to-day setting. So somebody notes they always mix up formula with bottled water. So let's talk about that. What might sense be where you want to switch away from simply preparing powdered formula with bottled water and going into a more detailed preparation?
So I don't think there's really any particular benefit to using bottled water versus not. And certainly not enough of a difference to make a strong recommendation either way. One thing to keep in mind with bottled water is that it's not necessarily like free of bacteria, so it still should be boiled. And we need that boiled water not just for the water itself, but also to sterilize to kill anything that's in the formula powder itself. It's a really poorly understood idea, but powdered formula is not in and of itself sterile. It's not sterile when it goes in, and it definitely isn't sterile after you've opened it and you've scooped. Challenges in an emergency is that it's hard to maintain hygiene, so you're introducing more and more bacteria into those food pieces. So generally speaking, I don't have a strong opinion about using bottled water versus tap water, whatever people prefer, but keeping in mind that bottled water isn't necessarily a significant advantage if you have potable water coming out of the tap.
So let's break that down. So I am regularly. I go out shopping with my family. I go to the mall. I pack a small, maybe I powdered formula to making up a bottle if the baby needs it. Maybe I'm only bringing formula as a backup in case, maybe I get the baby to latch and we're having lunch together as a family, food court. But whatever the circumstances are in those regular, we kind of are assessing the risks, right? We're looking at the risks and balancing that against the practical reality that maybe our baby's a little older, newborns, any. So what happens in the context of an emergency setting? And I think this is maybe this risks. What is it going to look like?
Sorry, I missed that last piece of what you said.
Describe what it's going to look like in an emergency setting. What are people confronted with when they have to evacuate? And say they arrive at an evacuation center after they've been on the road. Maybe they got evacuated this year in Alberta, evacuations from east of Edmonton, from Drayton Valley, from Edson. They were 3 or 4 hours on the road and they arrived at a reception center. What's the difference between that and our regular everyday?
I think the difference is a couple things. One is that there are rarely facilities in reception centers where that look anything like. More commonly than not, we see parents preparing bottles in bathrooms. They rinse them out in the washroom and they prepare them there because that's just the only place where there's running water in a lot of facilities. And that's one of the things I think that really needs to change in terms of planning. We need better planning for parents to be able to be received at the first step. But generally speaking, the first couple of hours at a reception center are pretty chaotic. There are a lot of people around. There's a lot of mess. People are trying to figure out what's going on. So the ability to actually wash your hands with soap and water, to find a place that's clean, to prepare it is minimized. You don't have a fridge, so you can only prepare one bottle at a time. Mm-hmm. And the other piece that comes up very quickly is bugs, and those are kind of all over the environment. Again, very different than when you're at home. That's one of the things I think is really hard to communicate to people, is how quickly our normal world comes undone when something big happens in a community, something significant. And there are many places in the world that understand very, very well what it looks like when you don't have good water coming out of your tap. But Canadians tend to be pretty attached to our idea that there is infinite amounts of water pouring out of the tap and that you can always drink it very, very easily. So it can happen very quickly, and you're talking about an environment that's crowded and generally stressed. So that's, again, one of the reasons why I think the reception center.
Yeah, and also let's not forget that. I mean, I think it's realistic to suggest in a high-income country like Canada, the period of time when that social safety net is ripped out from us in an emergency. You might not be able to access the emergency room in your small city if there's been an emergency where there's injury, for example. We don't see our wildfires and floods are our emergencies, but let's just think about what it might be like in an earthquake, for example, or even in a small city where your local hospital is. So it may be safety nets, but in that particular period, you may be faced with a tummy bug for a baby is easily solved if you put it to the ER, maybe an overnight admission, and then you're home again. But if you don't have to that in that sense, that becomes unfortunately, even in a place that becomes a life-threatening emergency for in that moment. There's a comment in the chat here. First of all, we're talking about how thirsty we are.
Yes.
I had
some water.
I didn't bring a glass of water down.
No, we got water. She was prepared.
Right.
So, there's a question in the chat. If breastfeeding women need 12 liters of water a day, so much to carry around, how can we support these moms and babies? Well, actually, breastfeeding don't need 12 liters of water a day, unless it was 2 liters of water a day. And they were, when you prepare, you bring drinking water with you. You might arrive, normally has water at that moment, but it's 2 liters of water a day per person. And our water company sends a water truck up your street as the water gets settled off. They're planning a certain amount of water for the number of people that live on the street. We've changed that. COVID made us about hygiene and hand washing. It's now liters of water a day. That's per person for every individual in your home. That's what you need for personal hygiene. Breastfeeding women don't need really anything significant extra there. So if you're breastfeeding, maybe feed a little more and worry about the complexities of formulation. Focus on a little bit more skin to skin, maybe feed as often than you would usually feed, have food security and safety. As long as you have water to drink, you're going to be okay. It's the families who are mixed feeding or who that are really at risk here.
Yes, sorry. So I'll repeat that because I'm assuming you probably can hear me better. So what Jodine was saying is that people really only, historically it was 2 liters per day. Now with the understanding of hand washing and other things that it's now, I think we're recommending 4 liters a day per person. The big difference, I think, with someone who is also breastfeeding and versus someone who's perhaps not totally breastfeeding is that for adults that we'd really worry about for young kids. So I'm thinking back to some of the issues that we've had over the years with nitrites in water, for example, which is what happens. You have runoff often from farm fields, which can happen during flooding or other kinds of things. So babies are very sensitive to the nitrites, and we really worry about them getting nitrite poisoning, which can be very, very damaging to their health. But an adult can generally drink that water without too much risk, at least in the short term. Again, that's sort of how our bodies by leaning on the parent's body to take those things out of the system that are not safe for them, and make sure that the human milk is really safe. So there are other pressures that happen when we have a lot of reliance on bottle feeding and formula feeding in a community, and one of those is that community really has a much higher reliance on that clean water.
So let me ask you, a breastfeeding mom, how much water does she need to be drinking?
Generally as much as another adult would drink. Encouraging people to make sure that they're paying attention to their thirst, which is sometimes a problem with parents. But generally, for most people, even if they're a little bit low on water, most busy parents are a little low on water most days. That they don't need to worry about any kind of impact to their own health or their own supply. Again, we want to make sure that parents are at their best because we're asking a lot of them. So making sure that they're looking after themselves is important. We still need to be prioritizing in an emergency planning perspective, making sure that people who are pregnant and people who are lactating have priority access to that food and water because they have so many other responsibilities. But I'm not particularly worried about that they
need to change the amount of drink when you're breastfeeding emergency. If you normally know, maybe you get up in the morning and you fill your liter water bottle, and then 4 o'clock you fill it again, and you're consciously trying to make sure 2 liters of water a day, just pack 2 liters for yourself because your body's not going to need more water just because it's an emergency.
Right. So the call to action here is most that need to be displaced, because when we think about how encumbersome it could be to transport all this water, to be thinking about the amount of water you've got to have at home just in case. Some people don't even have the room to storage all that water. So the call to action is to the community itself, and how do we reach to those people to ensure that there's enough water, that there's enough places with hygiene. This is where the big education has to come in, and I think all of us as agents of change, if we active and talk about this with everybody that we know, and we visit community centers or libraries or places that normally will support those placements of families, to make sure that they know about this and spread the word. That's extremely important, because when I hear you and I'm thinking about all the families in how distressed they will be, and also thinking about how to get prepared, this is already an item that is going to stress them. I cannot do
And
it. It's too much for me, right? So how?
And we shouldn't be stressing families. What should be happening here is, in every local community, the preparedness people who are paid. Let's just, how many are here under the age of 2? How many are here under the age of 1? How many babies are born? And then they reach out to their public health folks and say, what's our breastfeeding in our community? And how much water am I to prepare in order to support those families who are partially breastfeeding and are formula dependent? The question in the chat about the 12-liter amount for families. This is such a good question, because we really, that 12-liter amount is not for preparing formula from powder. That was surrounding. If you have formula, you may have ready formula, but you may not have been able to acquire maybe your bottle feeding, and you have those single serve bottles, but you have one nipple and you have 6 bottles. That's how they're typically sold, or sometimes sold in a case out of maybe 12 or 24, and one sterile nipple. So once you use that nipple once, you don't have a sterile nipple anymore, and switch to cup feeding, or you got to figure out how to wash. So that 12 liters is the amount that's necessary to still do hydration for the formula. Focus on, and really the burden on our local authorities, our provincial authorities in here in Canada, our national authorities, so that they're considering needs of families with infants, of women who have just birthed, who maybe had a C-section, absolutely aren't going to be, they're barely able to carry. Maybe we have a large of newborns in a population that, for whatever reason, is not breastfeeding well, or is not breastfeeding exclusively. It's up to our the needs of this population. We're doing a really good job in Canada, I think, of starting to recognize needs. We're recognizing the needs of our population. We're recognizing that we have within our population other vulnerabilities, disabled people, significant special needs. We're recognizing that families that have pets struggle to evacuate without being able to have a place for their pets to come on arrival. So we have lots of effort that's going into supporting pets in emergencies through preparedness, so that families can be less stressed and focus on taking care of their most basic needs, feeding their littlest ones and having shelter for their littlest ones, without having to also stress about how am I going to carry 24 liters times 3 to my car in this evacuation order.
A big call to action to everybody, really. I think it's a topic that nobody ever thinks. Number one, nobody ever thinks about moms and babies in emergency situations. We rarely read in the media, or we hear about people talking what happens with moms and babies. Very rarely. So on top of it, we are adding something as simple as water that nobody is really paying attention. And I think that if everybody will join us in this effort, and I repeat it, movement that we are trying to create, this awareness that we are trying to create, in a way to just be prepared, just be preventative. We say it in the film, it's much cheaper than cure. So let's think about all of the things that we don't want to think about. Let's think about all the things that are uncomfortable and nobody wants to talk about. Sometimes it's important. Let's talk about it. Let's unite those voices. And I think that with this, unless you have something else that you want to add, I'd like to invite everybody to join milkhood.com, Safely Fed Canada. Screenings and workshops coming up. Some of them are virtual and some of them are in person. One in this weekend coming up in person in Edmonton. Everybody's invited. Please join and register. And a couple of others before the end of the year that are coming in virtually. So everybody's welcome to join as well. And then stay tuned for what's happening in the future, that as we start 2024, there will be new announcements of some more programs in different parts of Canada. I'd like to take one moment also to share with the audience that we launched the Milk Educational Program in Turkey this week. And it was really very emotional to be surrounded by so many people that were with us. The feedback has been very positive. And here we are talking about a country that has, and at the same time, there were a lot of questions from the audience that were not aware about the minute little things that we take for granted. So the workshop was really, really very helpful, and we are coming back. And Guatemala, where we are starting in February as well. So stay tuned. There's a lot coming for us. We are going to come back live in the beginning of the year or in February with more news. And if we don't talk live again before the end of the year, I'd like to raise a glass of water for everybody and wish everybody a very happy holiday and a very healthy and a good beginning for all the new babies and for all the moms out there. So cheers.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for all that you do.
My pleasure. It's up to all of us to be together and everybody me on this journey, and let's continue trying to make a difference. That's all we can wish for.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.